It's the home of the man who has studied the Shroud closer and longer than anyone else. John Jackson is a doctor in cosmology and lecturer in physics. Together with his wife Rebecca, he runs the Turin Shroud Center of Colorado.
The first thing we come to is a photographic model.
Through his research, he has had one of the few full-size, high-definition still images of the Shroud for some time. In 1978, when interest in the Shroud was at its height, he led a large team of scientists to Turin, where they examined the Shroud for a week. No one since has secured such full access to the cloth. Significant amounts of different types of data were extracted. Jackson became the primary custodian of this data, and he has continued the work. Only now does he feel ready to share his findings exclusively with us. Unlike everyone else, Jackson wants to solve the riddle of the Shroud. If it's a 14th century forgery, then how was it done? Could a medieval artist have created the distinctive properties of this image? The first thing Jackson established is that the cloth can be wrapped around a body. The bloodstains on the back and front of the cloth match exactly where they should.
Place it over the three-dimensional man that we have here. Now, I'm going to pull this intentionally straight. And I would like you to notice, first of all, that this blood stain right here which is this at the bottom of the feet, is totally...
It's hanging off the end.
Yeah, it's totally off image. Look what happens when we make the hands align properly. Yeah. Look now what happens to the blood stain at the bottom of the cloth.
That matches.
Roll it back.
It's exactly where a nail would have been. Once key features were aligned, everything else fell into place, even the stains from one end of the cloth to the other. If we're dealing with a medieval relic, then it's one that's been meticulously created. And we know that the bloodstains are not paint. Jackson's team identified it as blood in 1978. But what of the image itself?
The image on the Shroud has some very interesting characteristics to it, and these are not only interesting, but they're scientific characteristics.
The simplest hypothesis is that the forger painted the image. The proof would be the presence of a medium to bind the pigment. We are going in now to a close-up of the darkest part of the image, the nose, and further to a microscopic picture of the same area.
The image is only on the surface fibrils of the cloth. These fibrils, which are on the order of the size or the diameter of a human hair, these are the fibrils that are twisted together to make threads. If you look, these fibrils are individually colored. They bear that color that is the body image at the microscopic level. Notice that those fibrils are not cemented together by any kind of paint. What we see, and this is the observation microscopically, is that the individual fibrils of the Shroud are colored.
To get a better understanding, we need to look at the cloth sideways on. If we magnify its thickness, we find that the fibrils that bear the image are literally just on the surface. Nothing has seeped into the cloth below.
What this observation does, and this illustrates the scientific method, is the hypothesis of an artist using a pigment that has some viscosity to it is excluded, I believe, by this singular observation on the Shroud.
If the image is not a painting, Jackson considered the idea that an embalmer subjected a real body to the horrors of crucifixion and then wrapped a cloth around it. But a simple look at the image of the face shows that contact between the body and the cloth alone could not have formed the image. The eye sockets and the other recesses of the body, as well as the hair at the side, would never have been in direct contact with the body. And if they were, the resulting image would look like this. If the image is a fake, it can't be the work of either a painter or an embalmer. Of course, the carbon-14 test still points to the shroud being a medieval relic. But Jackson has identified two properties of the image that a forger would have had to reproduce, properties that only modern technology can detect. The first is the fact that the naked eye only sees a negative image of the body.
This is important because if we're going to think of the image as being the work of an artist, then it would seem that what you have to deal with is the idea of somebody composing the image in a negative reverse to the way we normally see a human being, and put this onto a piece of cloth, a long piece of cloth, with a technique which also has definable characteristics. And this is a very difficult thing to imagine. You have to remember that whoever would have, or hypothetical artist, would have not had the luxury of being able to check his work.
The second unique property of the image is one discovered by Jackson himself, its three-dimensional quality. He discovered from his experimental wrappings that the intensity of the image varies with the distance the body is from the cloth. The tip of the nose, for example, is darker than the hollow of the eye. I wanted to know if we could see this with our new high-definition images. And sure enough, with the simplest press of a button in our editing suite, this 3D quality is revealed.
I was astounded when we were able to do this, that the brightness surface that you create by the computer looked, as you can see here, very much like a three-dimensional person, particularly the face. If you look at the facial structure, you've got the nose in proper relationship to the cheeks, which are in proper relationship to the eye sockets and so forth.
These special properties of the cloth narrow the options. Maybe the forger was a sculptor. A medieval technique for creating both properties is bas-relief. A sculptor creates a 3D model in stone or metal. To transfer the image onto the cloth, the bas-relief is heated and the cloth placed over it long enough to be scorched. It's an option that Jackson has experimented with. The real test of this method is whether the heated sculpture can scorch an image on the surface, and only on the surface, of the cloth.
So I used that, making a hot bas-relief, trying to impress that on the cloth. And yes, you can get some images that could have some pseudo three-dimensional quality and also a high resolution. But the problem there is that to put a surface discoloration on the cloth, on the fibrils, heat will discolor through the thickness of the shroud in about, it's about 1/100th to 1/10th of a second. So you would have to have the bas-relief on the cloth and take it away on a time scale like that in order to be consistent with what we observe. So it just goes on and on. But problems that just don't seem to work.
To avoid this problem, some tests have daubed paint to transfer the bas-relief onto the cloth. The result does show some negative and 3D qualities. The trouble is that they are distorted and crude. Also, this method uses paint, and the absence of any evidence of a binding medium on the cloth does rule that out.
I must say that that anyone who wants to try to explain the shroud image, and this work needs to continue, most definitely, but one has to make sure that you're working on a hypothesis that can explain the totality of all image characteristics, and you can't just go and pick and choose. You can't pick and choose what you want, and that's all too often what happens.
Science says the shroud is a 14th century fake, But so far, no one has found a medieval technique to accurately reproduce the image. No wonder the fascination with the Shroud of Turin continues. The search for a method of creating the image on the shroud will go on. But in the meantime, the failure is raising a new and controversial possibility. Is it possible that the carbon-14 test itself was in some way flawed? It's a possibility that's gaining currency because there is new evidence that places the Shroud of Turin earlier in time. Historians have identified another Shroud of Christ in the 12th century in Constantinople. And what I want to know is if this shroud could be the same as the one in Turin. If it is, it would push the date of the Turin shroud back by at least 160 years and challenge the accuracy of the carbon-14 test.